All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Real Estate Experience with myself, of course, Sterling White, where I'm going to be delivering the bombs and the absolute fire for you all of just my experiences as an entrepreneur and investor in this industry. So one thing I want to allude to, not perfect by any means. I still make mistakes to this day, and I share those mistakes through these episodes and also the successes as well. But one thing is, I make a lot more mistakes than I do have successes. But the thing is, with the mistakes, I don't look at them as mistakes. They're just more of learning lessons of what to avoid the next time around, and it's just feedback. So on today's episode, I'm going to be jumping into the lessons learned on an 80 unit acquisition. So going to be going into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of the successes of the deal and a little bit in terms of the structure. And then on top of that is also the mistakes that were made. This deal was, I would say, got it at a good price, especially in today's environment. But let me go ahead and just jump right into, if you haven't already, if you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel. You're missing out, so you can get these updates. And then those of you who are on iTunes, it would mean the world to me if you were to subscribe, rate, and also review, because there's tons of giveaways that I do have along with that, including a free copy of my book, From 0 to 400 Units. And if you haven't got that already, you can visit sterlingwhiteofficial.com. That is sterlingwhiteofficial.com to be able to get your free copy. But those of you who do rate and also review the podcast and send a screenshot to support at sterlingwhiteofficial.com, you'll get free copy of the book digital. In addition to that, you'll get the audiobook version, my free guide on step-by-step how to acquire multifamily, and then also a case study of how I did my first deal, and a call with myself as just a strategy call. So I'm giving as much value as I can away to you guys, and at the end of each week, 2 people will get that. So enough of that. And one thing I want to mention, if you're just now coming across me and this is your first episode or first time seeing me on YouTube, that is completely my fault. But I want to mention is born and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana, in the not so good parts of the city where you wouldn't want to walk your dog at night or even during the day. Very tough environment. I remember one of the apartments that I lived in, the bottom floor actually had cages on the outside, and I got so used to hearing gunshots, unfortunately, that it was like firecrackers going on outside, and it was just very common. But you just had to get down on the floor to avoid any just stray bullets. But that's just a little bit about that. Don't want to go too far into that, but had a single mother that raised both my brother and I. We lived in subsidized housing, Section 8, had food stamps is what we lived up on. But kudos to my mother for doing the best with what she had. And through that, anything above and beyond that as a kid that I wanted, I had to figure out how to earn money in a legal sense, because there was tons of illegal activity that was going on around me, but was always a good kid and did not take that path. Unfortunately, my brother did take the not so good, but myself, I just want to be an ideal for those individuals that are in that environment that, hey, you don't have to take this path. There is another, because when you're there, a lot of times that's all that you know. So I just want to be that ideal for those individuals that, hey, there's a different path, that you don't have to take this common one. But enough of that. Is first product was Kool-Aid. So this is where the whole entrepreneurship spirit came into existence for me. So first product was Kool-Aid. Second was Pokemon cards, and just selling anything that I can get my hands on at that time, just to get the cool things as a kid. I believe that would impress people. And then the fast forward, got started in real estate 2009, where my college roommate, shout out to AP if you're watching this or listening to this, he drugged me into his father's construction company, and that's when I fell in love. Not so much with getting my hands dirty, but enjoyed real estate as a whole, and then ended up shifting more to the investing, where many of you know, found a mentor, and then scaled up to 150 single families, and then shifted entirely to multifamily, and today own just under 500 units. And there's a team involved. It's just not myself, and I give huge kudos to them. It comes down to building the right team, being able to push yourself up as much as possible, the focus on the high value, which at my company, it's doing content marketing, bringing value to you all, bringing more awareness to the company, bringing on investor partners is one thing. In addition to that, heading the property acquisitions, which tons of rejection that's in that for sure. You have to turn over a lot of frogs in order to find that princess or prince. I think that's how that analogy goes, but you know where I'm going with that. And yeah, tons of rejection, getting kicked in the face, but you just have to get through it, overcome those objections, and just stay in the game and be the follow-up, which follow-up is an absolute must, especially when you're in this business. That's just me experience sharing. But let's go ahead and jump right into the lessons that were learned on this 80 unit acquisition, which was on the south side of Indianapolis. And I'll give you point one. That was the first lesson, which is to never overlook a deal. Meaning this specific one, so went direct to the owner, and they had sent over the financials to the property. So I do want to give a shout out to E-Money, who was the individual in-house that was assisting with the acquisitions and brought the deal to us. So on that is never overlooking the deal. He sent over the financials and mentioned that, hey, you guys should just take a look at it. It's probably not going to be a good deal, but once I dug into it, which I'm not an underwriter, I clearly saw that a lot of the expenses were misallocated, meaning that a lot of those expenses, it was about 70% expense ratio, which that in itself shows you that normalized this type of property should be between about 45 to 50% expenses. But a lot of those were due to decks being completed, the decks being repaired, and there was also some interior upgrades, repairs that were, a lot of it should have been pushed to a separate category, capital improvements, if I'm not mistaken, but they were misallocated incorrectly, showing within the regular expenses. They should have just been pushed somewhere else. And so with that, dug into it, saw at the current price that we wanted to offer, and normalized the expenses. And normalized is just essentially saying that this is where a property of this nature should be operating at. At that point in time, we were very close in terms of the purchase. So I believe originally the owner was at either 3.6 or 3.7, and we were at 3.1 or so, and just ended up meeting in the middle, or more on our side, we ended up meeting at 3.5 as far as the purchase price, and then ended up moving forward with the due diligence shortly after that. But that's one thing I want to mention, is to never overlook a deal. Always as much go into detail if you can. But one thing is, you want to have that someone who's good at underwriting, that's looked at so many, so that they can tell that, okay, this is something, because you don't want to dig so much if you're looking at a lot of deals, because a lot of them will not work out. But you want to be very familiar to where if you see something that's operating at 70% expense ratio, that you know that, okay, let's dig a little bit more deeper. This may actually be a good deal. So that's the first thing. The second is to put everything in writing. So one experience that was a mistake that was on a deal right before this one, which was the 118 unit that many of you, I did express of the why I walked away from that. And if you haven't already seen that, that is in a previous episode on this podcast, why I walked away from an 118 unit. And that was due to the roofs being a red flag, and essentially that the cost was just too high in order to move forward with purchasing the deal. But took that lesson on this one. Roofs were questionable. So with that, was able to get the seller to replace the roofs right before closing. But the thing was that did not get in writing was how the roofs were to be replaced. So the thing is, there is a big difference between a roof overlay versus tear off. So with that, the seller just did a roof overlay on the layer that was there. Luckily, there's not too many layers, but it would have been more beneficial for the longevity to have a tear off versus just the overlay. So have everything in writing, meaning that once we came to an agreement that the seller would replace the roofs, that we would detail in a contract how they would be replaced. So that was the learning lesson on that one. And then the next is negotiating with the lender. So on this one is we ended up going with a regional bank to provide the financing. So total purchase, as I alluded to, was $3.35 million, of which the lender provided 70% of that price. And then the remaining was a raise from partners, and then also contributed capital as well as a co-investment. But with that is negotiating with the lender. So the lender wanted the full course of the loan to be recourse. So with agency debt going with Fannie or Freddie, those are, I would say, a lot of the time non-recourse, which is preferable to go through those providers. But in this case, we had went with them several times and it just didn't end up working out. So we went with a regional bank that was a little bit more flexible, and we had contacts with someone who was high up. So there wasn't a lot of spider webs that were involved. The person who we were talking to had a high influence on the decision on the loan going through. So that was great. But through the term, they wanted it to be entirely recourse, but we were able to get it recourse over the first 2 to 3 years. And then the remaining of the term, which is 7 years, it would be non-recourse. Of course, there's certain bad boy carve-outs, such as if there's fraud committed or things of that nature, then they can come after us. But that's standard with any non-recourse loan normally. So that's that. The fourth is finding the motivation of the seller. So with this specifically, the seller was not so interested in the actual price. They just wanted to take those funds and be able to leverage them as startup capital for their next business. So we were able to find that motivation and just provide assurance that we had the ability to close, and that was what was really most important to them. It wasn't even price. So finding someone's motivation, because it's not necessarily with everyone about price. Someone else, prime deal that I'm working on another deal that working through is there is a brother and there is a sister. The sister is managing the apartments, so she's in the trenches, completely tired of it. So that's one problem is taking that property off her hands. But the brother on the other end is not as motivated. He has different problems that I have yet to figure out what is his motivation to solve that. So right now we're pretty stagnant in terms of being able to push it to the closing table or push it to contract, because have not figured out what his motivation is. I thought I had what his motivation is and what his problem was and looking to solve that, but it's just not enough to where he is now ready to pull the trigger and selling, versus the sister who's managing the property is completely done. So it's about solving his problems and to get things to progress forward. So there's that, finding motivation. And then the fifth is persistence. And this deal it was a longer cycle. So originally the owner, it took multiple contacts just to get in touch with the owner of the property. And then it took follow-ups after that, because originally they were not interested in selling. And then it took multiple phone calls and also times to meet them in person to convert them from not interested to then interested. I know those of you, there's a little bit of a common thread how throughout many of these episodes I talk about the follow-up, because the follow-up is very important. It separates the amateurs from the pros. This is where the money is made, especially when you're going off market, and even when you're doing on market and you're nurturing those relationships with brokers. If you're the one that's staying top of mind, when they do have a deal that comes in, they're going to think of you versus all their other buyers that they may have that are not as in touch with them. So there's that, the persistence and just staying top of mind. And then lastly, the one that really separated was building the rapport with the seller of the property. So once came to terms of this was actually before going under contract of the property, met with him in his office at the specific property, and really just talked about not only the property itself, but what he was looking to do. This is where we found the motivation and was able to determine what he was wanting to do with the capital, and saw that it wasn't necessarily about the price. He is more of an old school guy, so he does business with people that he likes and trusts. So we were able to build that trust that, one, we were able to close, and we provided the assurance of closing that, hey, this is capital that we have to put as a down payment for the property, and we were able to provide this is our lender contact. So those are the ways that we were able to build the trust and rapport for the seller to go with us. Because the thing was, we were not the only people that was reaching out. There was multiple brokers that were in contact, and the funny thing is, after it closed, brokers reached out to me and asked what the price was that we ended up buying it for, and just mentioned, you stole that deal, you got a phenomenal deal on that. I was actually meeting with the owner several weeks after we had signed the contract with them. So that just goes to show you that there is definitely competition involved, especially in today's economic environment. But it just constantly following up, determining what someone's motivation is, and then solving that problem that they have, which I'm still looking to solve that problem on that other apartment with the brother and sister. But that's why you want to have a large enough pipeline in the event one does not end up working out, because there's that 156 units here in the city currently working through final stages of the due diligence, and there's been no red flags. So now it's the stage of raising money from our investor partners to then acquire the deal. It's definitely quite a bit of a value add, with the improvements just under $2 million, but tons of upside, and the largest deal that I have done thus far. And that was all found through a cold call. A simple cold call, through multiple follow-ups, of course, but just a simple cold call. I hope that all makes sense. So just to give you in summary of all the lessons that were learned is, one, never overlook a deal. This one was sent originally in a way that, hey, you guys should just take a look at it. And I'm not an underwriter myself, but I saw that the way the expenses were allocated, that, one, the property should not be running at 70% expense ratio, and then secondly, that those expenses that were associated with the property would not translate once the deal was acquired, because all those improvements were already done with the decks. There was some interior renovations, but it was a lot of like heavy lifting that was completed, such as the decks was the biggest repair, but it was done, so that wouldn't translate. And then the second is to put everything in writing, meaning on this specific one that there was roofs were replaced, but how the roofs were replaced was the key. Preferably wanted a tear off versus a overlay. Third is everything's up for negotiation. Simply was able to negotiate with the lender to do the several years up front recourse versus the entire term of the loan recourse. I was able to get the back half non-recourse. And the difference between recourse and non-recourse in a way is, just sticking with the non-recourse, is if things don't go so well and the bank has to take back the property, that they don't come after you. Everything's associated with the property. Fourth is find the motivation of the seller and then be able to figure out how you can solve that problem for them. 5 is persistence. Persistence is the biggest one to me, because it is all about the follow-up. And then last is build rapport. One thing that I always do when showing up to meet with owners of properties is I always take a thank you card. And I always provide them that thank you card. It's just thank you for your time. It's very precious. If you looking forward to working with you on this transaction. Hopefully that all made sense. I know I just breezed through it a little bit, but those are the lessons, and the real successes is just the key follow-up. That's what it comes down to. The biggest mistake from this was just simply having everything in writing, and through the course of doing these deals is just getting better and better at not only improving the way that doing deals themselves, but also the infrastructure. So the way to raise money, the way to actually do the due diligence, meaning that have the phase 1 come out, the inspector come out, because there's tons of moving parts, but constantly tweaking, documenting what's being completed, and then that way the next time it's done, that it's so much more seamlessly and efficient because we've been through it multiple times, and we can either go through it ourselves or that is properly documented to then delegate to someone and just oversee it. So one thing I want to provide is a book recommendation. I have to mention, as always, that if you haven't already, free copy of my book, From 0 to 400 Units. Visit sterlingwhiteofficial.com to grab your free copy. That is sterlingwhiteofficial.com to grab your free copy. And one book I want to provide is, well, I'm not providing it, but I just want to do a experience share on it. Love doing these experience shares. Is A 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss. And if you haven't already read this, most of you have already read this, but the main premise I got from this book was not a 4-hour work week, which I don't know if he was actually getting at that, but I believe what my biggest takeaway was just being more efficient with your time and delegating a lot of the mundane things to push yourself up to focus on more of the highest value activity, leveraging virtual assistants, hiring staff in place, etc., and being just documenting the way you do things and then delegating. So those are the biggest things I took away from that book. And then also is doing something that just scares the living crap out of it. So for me, I attempted a world record 4 years ago, which the world record was the Guinness World Record for the world's fastest fireman carry mile. And no, I'm not a fireman carry, for those of you who are thinking that. I just did that as a way to stretch myself. And I was training for this record at that CrossFit gym for a year and a half. The thing is when it came time to actually do it, so there was a lot of build up, news reporters came out, I was on the news for it, this worthy cause, because all of the funds were going to cancer research, because I did have a friend that did lose their life due to cancer. But on that is the day of the event, actually a couple weeks before the event, the partner that I was practicing with. So what you do is for this record, you carry a person of equivalent weight and you have to run around the track for a mile. And there was a specific time that I had to beat. And the person I was training with backed out a month in advance. So to that, I could have simply just took that as an obstacle that, hey, this is not going to be a good fit. Let's shut down the attempt. But no, I ended up finding someone, a wrestler at University of Indianapolis, which is where I used to wrestle at. And they stepped in. I forget his name, but kudos to you if you just happen to be listening. And the day of the event was an absolute failure. I fell on my face completely. Halfway through the attempt, I dropped the person, which that ends the attempt. And so what I realized, and this was another aha moment for me, that failure is not so bad, especially on that large scale, because there was the news out there that was recording, there was friends that were there was family, there was people from just the local that just happened to see it on the news and came by, and I just bombed it. So that was a unlock for me, that failure is just a way of feedback and just a way to not do things, but it's not so bad at the end of the day. It's better to go for it, because I felt that if I had been training all up to that point and then I stopped once that the individual that I was training with backed out, it would have been worse. I would have been kicking myself to this day that I did not actually go through with it. So it was better for me to fail. Well, didn't want to fail, but it was better to fail than to not do it at all. So I do truly appreciate everyone who's listening to these. And if there's any way I can be of assistance, don't ever hesitate to reach out. I'm ultimately here to serve you. And one thing I did just put together is a small group of individuals that I would be personally working with, mastermind group, you can say, and that you can get more details on that visit sterlingwhiteofficial.com. That is sterlingwhiteofficial.com for details. There is a select few people that will be entering in that, and we'll go over ways to raise money, find investors, find deals, which is by far one of the most difficult things in today's climate. But I'll pull back the curtain on how I do things like I do on these episodes, and also would love to hear others' experience sharing of the best practices that they implement. So it's just collectively working together. So thank you so much. Go out there and crush it. Have a great one. Thanks for listening to The Real Estate Experience. If this has brought you any value, please subscribe and leave a 5-star rating. It would mean the world to me. Now go out there and crush it.